Hello, friends. Today, I'm going to share with you a story that will reveal the hidden face of one of history's greatest leaders, a face you've never heard of before, Julius Caesar. Yes, we all know him, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who crossed the Rubicon, who loved Cleopatra, and who was ultimately assassinated on the Ides of March. But what if I told you that Caesar's real story is far darker, far more mysterious, and incredibly more shocking than anything you've ever imagined? Tonight, we're going to discover a Caesar that history books never mention. A Caesar with secrets that will shake everything you thought you knew. A genius who could read people's thoughts, see into the future, and even calculate his own death with mathematical precision. If you want to learn who Caesar really was, if you want to uncover one of history's greatest mysteries, then don't leave this video, because what you're about to hear will prove that everything you know about Caesar is completely wrong. And please, don't forget to like this video, leave your comments, and subscribe to our channel so more people can hear this incredible story. Because stories filled with secrets like this can only be found here. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourself in the narrow streets of ancient Rome. Because Caesar's real story is about to begin. In the heart of Rome, within the narrow streets of Sabira district, a child was born who would live a destiny no one could imagine. Gaius Julius Caesar was far more complex, far more human than the conqueror and dictator the world knows. History books tell of his victories, his political genius, and the death that would eventually come. But the real Caesar, the one hidden in shadows, possessed secrets that would astonish even his closest allies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Caesar's private villa as he stood before his reflection, not admiring his conquest, but studying something far more intimate. The peculiar birthmark on his shoulder that resembled the constellation Cassiopeia. His mother Aurelia had told him it was a sign from the gods, but Caesar knew better. It was a reminder of mortality, a flesh-bound map of stars that would guide him through his most dangerous moments. What the senators whispered in corridors of power, what even Cleopatra never discovered, was that Caesar possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's intentions through the smallest of gestures. This gift, or curse as he sometimes considered it, had been with him since childhood. He could detect lies in the flutter of an eyelash, betrayal in the subtle shift of shoulders, loyalty in the way someone breathed. This uncanny perception had saved his life more times than his sword ever had. The origin of this extraordinary ability traced back to his 7th year, when young Gaius fell gravely ill with a fever that lasted 14 days. During those delirious nights, as his body burned with unnatural heat, something fundamental shifted in his perception of the world. When the fever finally broke, leaving the physicians amazed at his recovery, Caesar found himself able to perceive patterns in human behavior that had previously been invisible. It was as if illness had stripped away a veil between his consciousness and the hidden motivations that drove every person he encountered. His childhood in the Sabira, Rome's most dangerous neighborhood, became an unexpected education in the art of survival through observation. While patrician children learned rhetoric and mathematics in comfortable villas, Caesar studied the intricate social dynamics of criminals, prostitutes, merchants, and slaves who populated the narrow streets of his birthplace. He learned that survival depended not on strength or wealth, but on the ability to predict human behavior with mathematical precision. The young Caesar developed a practice he would maintain throughout his life: the creation of detailed psychological profiles of everyone he met. In secret chambers beneath his family home, he maintained scrolls containing observations about hundreds of individuals, noting their speech patterns, physical habits, emotional triggers, and potential weaknesses. These weren't mere character sketches, but complex analyses that treated human personality as a code waiting to be deciphered. When Caesar reached the 16th year, an incident occurred that would shape his understanding of power for the rest of his life. His uncle Marius, the great general, took him to witness an execution in the Forum. As a condemned man was led to his death, Caesar observed something that escaped everyone else present. The executioner's hands were trembling with such subtle precision that it seemed almost intentional. Later investigation revealed that the executioner had been paid to ensure the victim suffered as little as possible. This moment taught Caesar that even in death, competing loyalties and hidden motivations created layers of meaning invisible to casual observers. On that fateful day when he crossed the Rubicon, Caesar wasn't driven by ambition alone. Hidden in his personal correspondence, which he ordered burned upon his death, were letters from a network of spies he had cultivated across the known world. These weren't ordinary informants. The philosophers, merchants, and even slaves who had witnessed something extraordinary. They spoke of lands beyond the edges of maps, of civilizations that had mastered science as Rome could barely comprehend, of mathematical principles that could predict the rise and fall of empires. Caesar's true obsession wasn't just conquering Gaul or defeating Pompey. It was unlocking these ancient secrets before time ran out. The great general had a ritual that no historian recorded. Every morning before dawn, in complete solitude, he would practice what he called the discipline of memory. Caesar had trained himself to recall every conversation, every face, every detail from the previous day with perfect clarity. This mental exercise had transformed his mind into a living archive of human behavior, political intrigue, and strategic knowledge. When senators marveled at his ability to remember every soldier's name in his legions, they attributed it to natural talent. They never suspected the grueling mental exercises that began before the city awakened. The technique involved a complex visualization process that Caesar had developed after studying the memory methods of Greek philosophers and Egyptian priests. He would mentally construct elaborate architectural spaces, imaginary palaces with countless rooms, where he stored different categories of information. Political conversations occupied the eastern wing. Military intelligence filled the northern towers. Personal observations about individuals were cataloged in the southern gardens. This mental palace grew increasingly sophisticated over the years, eventually becoming a vast imaginary city that contained the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. But perhaps Caesar's most closely guarded secret lay in his relationship with pain. During his younger years, captured by pirates who demanded a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar didn't just mock their prices too low. He used a captivity to study human nature under extreme conditions. The pirates, unknowingly, became his unwilling teachers in psychology of power and fear. When he later returned to crucify them, as he had promised, he ordered their legs broken first, not out of cruelty, but was a calculated demonstration that mercy and vengeance could coexist, creating a reputation that would precede him across the Mediterranean. During those 38 days of captivity, Caesar conducted what amounted to an intensive study of criminal psychology. He observed how the pirates' behavior changed under different circumstances, how they reacted to threats, bribes, flattery, and challenges. He noted the subtle hierarchies within their band, identifying the true decision-makers despite their attempts to conceal the chain of command. Most importantly, he learned that even the most desperate men follow predictable patterns of behavior when subjected to the right combination of psychological pressures. The physical ailments that plagued Caesar throughout his life, the falling sickness, as epilepsy was known, weren't just medical conditions, but sources of profound philosophical insight. During each seizure, in those moments when consciousness slipped away, Caesar experienced visions that he never shared with anyone, not even his closest confidant Mark Antony. These visions showed impossible futures, fractured images of Rome's destiny that both terrified and inspired him. He learned to time his most crucial decisions around these episodes, using the clarity that followed each seizure to see through the fog of political deception. Caesar's approach to his epilepsy revealed a methodical mind that characterized all his endeavors. Rather than viewing his condition as a weakness to be hidden, he studied it as a phenomenon to be understood and potentially exploited. He maintained detailed records of his seizures, noting their frequency, duration, and the circumstances that seemed to trigger them. Over time, he discovered patterns that allowed him to predict when episodes were likely to occur, enabling him to schedule important meetings and negotiations during periods when his mental acuity would be at its peak. The visions that accompanied his seizures were unlike anything described in medical texts of the time. Caesar saw not random hallucinations, but coherent scenarios that seemed to depict possible futures for Rome and its empire. Some visions showed Rome expanding beyond any boundaries he had imagined, with legions marching across lands that existed far beyond the known world. Others revealed the city consumed by civil wars that made current political conflicts seem like children's games. Most disturbing were the visions that showed Rome itself transformed into something unrecognizable. Its institutions evolved beyond anything his contemporaries could comprehend. Caesar's legendary relationship with Cleopatra contained layers that would make poets weep. Their famous meeting, when she was smuggled to him wrapped in a carpet, was orchestrated not by her desperate need for Roman protection, but by a mutual fascination with ancient Egyptian mathematics. Cleopatra had discovered papyri containing geometric principles that could revolutionize Roman architecture and military engineering. Their nights together were spent not just in passion, but in decoding these mathematical mysteries by candlelight. The son they produced, Caesar, was born to a world where his father's greatest gift wasn't political power, but an insatiable hunger for knowledge that transcended traditional boundaries. The mathematical principles that Cleopatra shared with Caesar dealt with concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by European scholars for more than 1,000 years. Ancient Egyptian engineers had developed techniques for calculating the structural loads of massive stone constructions, methods for predicting the flooding cycles of the Nile with astronomical precision, and most remarkably, mathematical models for understanding the growth and decline of civilizations over centuries. These calculations suggested that empires follow predictable patterns of expansion, consolidation, and eventual collapse, patterns that could potentially be altered if understood properly. Caesar and Cleopatra spent countless hours working through these mathematical models, applying them to Rome's current situation, and projecting possible futures. The results were both exhilarating and terrifying. According to the Egyptian calculations, Rome was approaching a critical transition point, where it could either evolve into something unprecedented in human history, or collapse into chaos that would destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. Their intimate relationship was inseparable from this shared intellectual quest to unlock the fundamental laws governing human civilization. The Gallic Wars, celebrated as Caesar's masterpiece of military conquest, concealed a deeper purpose that would shock Rome's citizens. Caesar wasn't simply subduing barbarian tribes. He was systematically collecting their oral histories, their astronomical observations, their medicinal knowledge. The Druids he encountered possessed wisdom about plant pharmacology that surpassed anything Roman physicians understood. In his private tent, illuminated by oil lamps that burned until dawn, Caesar compiled notes that read more like the work of a natural philosopher than a military commander. He documented Gallic methods for predicting weather patterns, their understanding of crop rotation, and their surprisingly sophisticated grasp of metallurgy. The Druids represented something that fascinated Caesar beyond their obvious political and military significance. They maintained oral traditions that stretched back centuries, preserving knowledge about astronomical cycles, agricultural techniques, and herbal medicine that had been refined through generations of careful observation. Unlike Roman learning, which focused on rhetoric, law, and military tactics, Jewish education encompassed what they called the wisdom of patterns, an understanding of the interconnected cycles that govern everything from the growth of plants to the rise and fall of human societies. Caesar's interactions with captured Druids revealed the existence of a vast intellectual network that spanned the Celtic world. These priest-scholars maintained contact across tribal boundaries, shared observations about natural phenomena and human behavior that challenged Roman assumptions about barbarian ignorance. They possessed mathematical concepts for calculating optimal planting times, medicinal formulas that could treat conditions Roman physicians considered incurable, and most intriguingly, historical models that suggested human societies evolved according to predictable patterns over centuries. The systematic collection of this knowledge became one of Caesar's primary motivations for extending the Gallic campaigns beyond mere military necessity. Each conquered tribe possessed unique elements of this intellectual tradition, and Caesar was determined to preserve their insights before Roman civilization either absorbed or destroyed them. His private notebooks contained detailed transcriptions of Druidic teachings, astronomical observations that corrected errors in Roman calendars, and medicinal formulas that he quietly shared with trusted physicians in Rome. What truly drove Caesar to the brink of exhaustion wasn't the physical demands of constant warfare, but a compulsive need to understand the underlying patterns of human civilization. He had become convinced that all great empires followed predictable cycles, and that Rome, despite its apparent invincibility, was already showing signs of decay that had consumed the Greeks, the Persians, and the Egyptians before them. His reforms, his dictatorial powers, even his affair with Cleopatra, all were calculated attempts to break these historical cycles and create something unprecedented, an empire that could evolve rather than simply expand and collapse. The philosophical framework that drove Caesar's analysis of historical patterns combined elements from Greek Stoicism, Egyptian mathematics, and Celtic wisdom traditions. He theorized that civilizations, like individual organisms, pass through predictable stages of birth, growth, maturity, and death. However, unlike biological entities, human societies might possess the capacity for conscious evolution, the ability to recognize and alter their developmental patterns through deliberate intervention. Caesar identified specific symptoms that appeared in all declining empires: increasing political fragmentation, growing disparities between rich and poor, loss of shared cultural values, and most critically, the replacement of merit-based leadership by hereditary or purely political advancement. Rome was already exhibiting these symptoms, but Caesar believed that conscious recognition of the pattern might enable deliberate countermeasures. His dictatorial reforms were not random power grabs, but systematic attempts to address each symptom of imperial decline. Land redistribution programs aimed to reduce economic inequality. Constitutional changes were designed to streamline political decision-making and reduce factional conflict. His integration of conquered peoples into Roman citizenship was intended to create shared cultural values that transcended ethnic boundaries. Most importantly, his emphasis on administrative competence over political connections was meant to ensure that merit, rather than birth or wealth, determined leadership positions. Caesar's relationship with his soldiers revealed another hidden dimension of his character. While history remembers his generosity and their devotion, the deeper truth was more complex. Caesar had developed an almost mystical connection with the rhythm of battle, an ability to sense the psychological momentum of thousands of men locked in combat. His veterans spoke in whispered tones of moments when their general seemed to know exactly when fear would turn to courage, when exhaustion would transform into desperate strength. This was a divine favor, as they believed, but the result of Caesar's relentless study of human behavior under the most extreme circumstances. The psychological techniques Caesar employed to maintain his soldiers' loyalty went far beyond material rewards and stirring speeches. He had developed what he privately called the mathematics of morale, a systematic understanding of the factors that influence fighting effectiveness under different conditions: temperature, time of day, duration since the last meal, recent news from home, the behavior of officers, the appearance and actions of enemies. All these variables could be quantified and their combined effect on soldier performance calculated with remarkable accuracy. Caesar maintained detailed records of every battle, noting not just tactical movements and casualties, but psychological factors that influenced the outcome. He documented how soldiers' fighting effectiveness changed during different phases of the lunar cycle, how weather conditions affected their willingness to take risks, how various types of pre-battle rituals influenced their subsequent performance. This accumulated data allowed him to optimize everything from the timing of attacks to the content of pre-battle speeches. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar learned to read the collective mood of large groups of men with an accuracy that bordered on precognition. He could sense a precise moment when a formation was about to break, when individual courage would inspire mass heroism, when tactical retreat would prevent total collapse. This ability wasn't mystical, but resulted from years of careful observation, combined with almost mathematical understanding of group psychology under extreme stress. The conspiracy that would eventually take his life was known to Caesar far earlier than the Ides of March. His network of informants had provided fragments of the plot weeks in advance, but Caesar faced a dilemma that would have destroyed a lesser man. He had calculated that his assassination might be necessary to prevent something far worse, a civil war that would tear Rome apart for decades. The letters he wrote during his final weeks, destroyed according to his instructions, revealed a man wrestling with an impossible choice between personal survival and the greater good of an empire. Caesar's analysis of conspiracy against him demonstrated the same methodical approach he applied to military and political challenges. Using information gathered by his extensive spy network, he constructed detailed psychological profiles of each potential conspirator, calculating their individual motivations and the probability of their participation in any assassination attempt. The results painted a disturbing picture of an empire whose ruling class had become so fragmented and desperate that violence seemed inevitable. The mathematical model Caesar and Cleopatra had developed suggested that Rome was approaching what they called a transition crisis, a period when existing institutions would either evolve dramatically or collapse entirely. Caesar's reforms had been designed to guide the transition, but their very success had created a coalition of threatened interests determined to prevent any change. The conspiracy represented more than personal animosity towards Caesar. It was the death struggle of an obsolete political system trying to preserve itself. Caesar's private correspondence during his final months reveals a man caught between competing loyalties and impossible choices. His duty to Rome's long-term survival conflicted with his natural instinct for self-preservation. His love for individual Romans conflicted with his understanding that major institutional changes would inevitably cause suffering for many people. Most painfully, his recognition that his own assassination might be necessary for Rome's evolution conflicted with his desire to see his intellectual projects completed. Caesar's private chambers contained something that would have scandalized Rome's elite, a collection of masks crafted by the finest artisans, each representing a different emotion or psychological state. These weren't theatrical props, but tools of self-analysis. Caesar would wear these masks while practicing speeches, training himself to embody the exact emotional resonance needed to sway different audiences. The mask of paternal authority for the Senate, the mask of brotherly camaraderie for his soldiers, the mask of passionate intensity for his lovers. This elaborate psychological theater allowed him to perfect the art of being precisely what each moment required. The masks represented Caesar's recognition that political leadership in a complex society required the ability to project different aspects of personality depending on circumstances. Each mask was carved to emphasize specific facial features and expressions, training Caesar to modify his natural appearance in ways that would unconsciously influence observers' perceptions. The paternal mask accentuated the lines around his eyes, creating an impression of wisdom and experience. The camaraderie mask softened his features, making him appear more approachable and trustworthy. The intensity mask sharpened his cheekbones and jawline, projecting strength and determination. Behind this theatrical approach lay a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that anticipated modern research by centuries. Caesar had observed that people's rational judgments were heavily influenced by unconscious emotional responses to facial expressions, vocal tones, and physical gestures. By consciously controlling these elements, he could shape others' perceptions and decisions in ways they never recognized. The masks were tools for what he privately called emotional mathematics, the precise calculation and manipulation of psychological responses. The psychological theater extended beyond facial expressions to encompass every aspect of Caesar's public appearance. His clothing, jewelry, posture, and even the timing of his gestures were carefully calculated to produce specific emotional effects on different audiences. When addressing the Senate, he adopted the measured movements in formal dress of traditional Roman authority. When speaking to his soldiers, his appearance became more casual and his gestures more animated, creating an impression of shared identity and common purpose. When negotiating with foreign dignitaries, his appearance and manner were adjusted to match their cultural expectations while subtly asserting Roman superiority. The great dictator's relationship with time itself bordered on the obsessive. Caesar had commissioned astronomers and mathematicians to create personal calendars that tracked not just the movement of celestial bodies, but the subtle rhythms of human behavior he had observed throughout his life. He knew that senators were most susceptible to persuasion on the third day after the new moon, that soldiers fought with greatest ferocity during the hour before sunset, that crowds gathered in the forum were most easily swayed when shadows grew long in the afternoon. This temporal mathematics became his secret weapon in countless political and military situations. Caesar's temporal calculations extended to an understanding of historical cycles that influenced human behavior over longer periods. He had identified patterns in Roman politics that repeated every 7 years, cycles of military effectiveness that peaked every 11 years, and economic fluctuations that followed 19-year periods corresponding to astronomical phenomena. These longer cycles allowed him to predict periods when major changes would be most feasible and times when resistance to change would be strongest. The personal calendars Caesar maintained tracked multiple overlapping cycles, affecting everything from individual psychology to large-scale social movements. Daily cycles influenced immediate decision-making and personal interactions. Weekly cycles affected political negotiations and military planning. Monthly cycles corresponded to agricultural and economic activities that shaped civilian morale. Annual cycles determined optimal timing for major campaigns and institutional reforms. The interaction of these various cycles created windows of opportunity that Caesar learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar's temporal mathematics allowed him to predict and plan for his own death with mathematical precision. The calculation suggested that his assassination would occur during a specific time period when political tensions, astronomical influences, and personal psychological factors converged to make violent action most likely. Rather than try and prevent this outcome, Caesar used his remaining time to ensure that his death would serve the larger purposes he had identified for Rome's future development. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar maintained a correspondence with individuals he called the Watchers, a loose network of scholars, mystics, and intellectuals scattered across the Mediterranean who shared his fascination with the hidden patterns underlying human civilization. These letters, written in a code that combined Latin, Greek, and mathematical symbols, discussed theories that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. They debated whether human societies might follow biological laws similar to those governing individual organisms, whether empires age and die according to predictable patterns, whether the rise and fall of civilizations could be mapped as precisely as the movement of planets. The Watchers represented Caesar's attempt to create an intellectual network that could survive the collapse of any individual empire or civilization. Members included a mathematician in Alexandria who had developed techniques for calculating the optimal size of cities, a physician in Athens who studied the relationship between social stress and individual health, a merchant in Carthage who tracked economic cycles across multiple cultures, and a Celtic druid who maintained oral histories spanning centuries. Each Watcher contributed unique perspectives and data to a collective understanding of human social evolution. The correspondence between Caesar and the Watchers reveals intellectual discussions that were centuries ahead of their time. They debated questions about the relationship between individual psychology and collective behavior, the role of technology in social change, the influence of environmental factors on cultural development, and the possibility that human consciousness itself might be evolving over historical time periods. Their letters contain speculations about mathematical principles governing social organization, astronomical influences on human behavior, and a potential for deliberate social engineering on a civilizational scale. Caesar's role as a central coordinator of this network positioned him as something far more significant than a military commander or political leader. He was attempting to function as a conscious agent of human evolutionary development, using political and military power as tools for implementing insights derived from systematic study of historical patterns. The Watchers provided him with data and analysis from across the known world, allowing him to test his theories about social development against evidence drawn from multiple cultures and time periods. Caesar's treatment of captured enemies revealed a psychological complexity that both impressed and disturbed contemporary observers. Rather than simply executing or enslaving defeated foes, he would often engage them in philosophical discussions that could last for hours. He was particularly fascinated by the moment when proud warriors accepted defeat, studying precise psychological mechanisms that transformed defiance into submission. These conversations weren't mere intellectual curiosities, but practical research into the nature of power itself. Caesar understood that true conquest occurred in the mind long before it manifested on any battlefield. The philosophical discussion Caesar conducted with captured enemies provided him with insights into the psychological foundations of resistance and submission that informed his approach to governance and military strategy. He discovered that the most effective way to secure lasting conquest wasn't through fear or bribery, but through psychological transformation that made former enemies genuinely loyal to Roman interests. This required understanding the specific beliefs, values, and identity structures that motivated different cultures. Caesar developed techniques for what he called conquest of the mind that involved systematic analysis of captured enemy psychological makeup, followed by carefully designed conversations intended to shift their fundamental loyalties. These weren't crude attempts at brainwashing, but sophisticated psychological interventions based on deep understanding of human motivation and identity. Caesar learned to identify the core beliefs that sustained enemy resistance and then demonstrate logical contradictions within those belief systems. The process typically began with Caesar showing genuine respect for enemies' courage and tactical skill, establishing himself as someone worthy of serious intellectual engagement. He would then gradually introduce philosophical questions about the nature of loyalty, honor, and political obligation encouraging enemies to examine the assumptions underlie their resistance. Through careful questioning, Caesar could often lead captured warriors to recognize conflicts between their stated values and their actual behavior, creating psychological openings for new loyalties to develop. The dictator's physical appearance, while well documented in marble statues and historical accounts, concealed subtle details that few observers noticed. Caesar had trained himself to control his breathing so precisely that he could remain completely calm during moments of extreme stress, giving him an almost supernatural presence during negotiations and confrontations. His hands, scarred from countless battles, moved with the precision of a surgeon when he gestured during speeches. Even his famous baldness, which he famously tried to conceal with laurel wreaths, became a calculated element of his public persona, a visible reminder of mortality that made his achievements seem more human and therefore more inspiring. Caesar's mastery of physical self-control extended far beyond breathing techniques to encompass every aspect of his bodily presence. He had studied the ways that posture, gesture, facial expression, and vocal tone influence others' perceptions and emotions, developing conscious control over these elements that bordered on the supernatural. Observers often noted that Caesar seemed to radiate an almost physical sense of authority and competence, never realizing that this presence was a result of decades of careful training and practice. The breathing techniques Caesar employed were based on methods he had learned from Eastern merchants and philosophers who had traveled the Silk routes connecting Rome, the distant Asian empires. These practices allowed him to maintain perfect emotional equilibrium even during the most stressful negotiations and military crises. His ability to remain calm when everyone around him was panicking became legendary among his soldiers and political associates, contributing to their confidence in his judgment and leadership. Caesar's control over his physical presence extended to micro-expressions and subtle body language that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, but powerfully influence others' emotional responses. He could project confidence without arrogance, authority without aggression, and concern without weakness through minute adjustments in posture, gesture, and facial expression. This mastery of nonverbal communication allowed him to shape the emotional tenor of meetings and negotiations before any words were spoken. The final months of Caesar's life were marked by an increasing preoccupation with dreams and their meanings. He had begun keeping a detailed journal of his nighttime visions, correlating them with subsequent political and military events. What emerged was a pattern that both fascinated and terrified him. His dreams seemed to anticipate major shifts in Roman politics with uncanny accuracy. The night before crossing the Rubicon, he had dreamed of eagles carrying serpents over a great river. The evening before his first meeting with Cleopatra, visions of golden pyramids reflected in still water. These nocturnal revelations became another layer of the complex decision-making process that guided his final actions. Caesar's dream journal reveals a sophisticated understanding of the unconscious mind that wouldn't be matched until development of modern psychology. He recognized that dreams often contained information that his conscious mind had perceived but not fully processed, and he developed techniques for interpreting symbolic content that provided insights into political and military situations. His dreams functioned as a form of unconscious analysis that processed complex social and political data while he slept. The correlation between Caesar's dreams and subsequent events wasn't mystical, but reflected his unconscious mind's ability to detect patterns and make predictions based on subtle cues his conscious awareness had missed. His dream of eagles and serpents before crossing the Rubicon represented his unconscious recognition that the coming conflict would involve the highest stakes and most dangerous opponents. The vision of pyramids before meeting Cleopatra reflected his intuitive understanding that this relationship would connect him to ancient wisdom traditions that could transform his approach to governance. Caesar's systematic study of his own dreams led him to develop what he called nocturnal intelligence, the ability to use dream content as a source of strategic insight. He learned to pose specific questions before sleep, and often found that dreams provided creative solutions to problems that had stymied his conscious analysis. This technique became particularly valuable during military campaigns when rapid decision-making was essential and conventional analysis was insufficient. The dream journal also reveals Caesar's growing awareness that his approaching death was not just a personal tragedy, but a necessary element in Rome's evolutionary development. His final dreams contain images of transformation and renewal that helped him accept his assassination as part of a larger historical pattern. rather than try and prevent his death. Caesar used his remaining time to ensure that his ideas and networks would survive to influence Rome's future development. Caesar's relationship with his adopted son Octavian, who would later become Augustus, contained depths that neither man fully understood during Caesar's lifetime. The aging dictator saw in a young man not just a political heir, but a kindred spirit capable of the same intellectual ruthlessness that had driven his own rise to power. Their private conversations, conducted during long walks through Caesar's gardens, covered topics that range from military strategy to the philosophical implications of absolute power. Caesar was preparing Octavian not just to rule Rome, but to continue his secret quest to understand and potentially transcend the historical cycles that doomed all empires to eventual collapse. The education Caesar provided Octavian went far beyond conventional political and military training. To encompass the full range of intellectual disciplines Caesar had mastered during his own career. He shared his techniques for psychological analysis, his methods for detecting deception, his understanding of economic and social cycles, and most importantly, his vision of Rome's potential evolution beyond the limitations that had destroyed previous empires. Caesar recognized that Octavian possessed the intellectual capacity and emotional detachment necessary to implement reforms that might prevent Rome's eventual collapse. The conversations between Caesar and Octavian during those final months revealed the older man's attempt to compress decades of accumulated wisdom into a crash course in civilizational management. Caesar shared his insights about the mathematical patterns underlying political behavior, his techniques for managing large-scale social change, and his understanding of the psychological factors that determine whether reforms would succeed or fail. He also shared his correspondence with the Watchers, introducing Octavian to the intellectual network that would provide ongoing guidance after Caesar's death. Caesar's preparation of Octavian represented his recognition that individual genius wasn't sufficient to guide civilizational evolution. The task required institutional continuity that could survive the death of any single leader. By sharing his intellectual methods and network connections with Octavian, Caesar was ensuring that his approach to governance could continue developing and evolving long after his own assassination. This transfer of knowledge and responsibility represented Caesar's most important legacy, far exceeding in significance any of his military conquests or political reforms. The weapons Caesar carried, while appearing conventional to casual observers, were modified according to precise specifications. His gladius had been rebalanced to account for the slight tremor in his left hand that resulted from his epileptic condition. His dagger, the one that would ultimately fail to protect him on the Ides of March, contained a hidden compartment filled with a powder made from rare herbs that could induce temporary paralysis, not for assassination, but for medical emergencies during his seizures. Even in the mundane details of personal armament, Caesar's analytical mind sought every possible advantage. The modifications Caesar made to his weapons reflected his systematic approach to problem solving and his refusal to accept limitations imposed by his physical condition. The rebalanced gladius not only compensated for the tremor in his left hand, but actually turned this apparent weakness into a tactical advantage by making his sword movements unpredictable to opponents who expected conventional fighting patterns. The modified grip and weight distribution allowed Caesar to maintain deadly effectiveness in combat despite his neurological condition. The herbal powder concealed in Caesar's dagger represented his integration of medical knowledge gained from various cultures into practical applications for personal protection. The compound could serve multiple purposes, inducing temporary paralysis in attackers, providing emergency treatment for severe seizures, or if necessary, ensuring a quick death if capture and torture seem inevitable. This multi-purpose approach reflected Caesar's preference for solutions that addressed multiple potential problems simultaneously. Caesar's attention to detail in personal armor extended to clothing, jewelry, and other accessories that might serve defensive purposes. His toga contained hidden pockets with medical supplies and emergency communication devices. His rings included hidden compartments with coded messages that could be delivered to specific network contacts if he was killed or captured. Even his famous laurel crown served practical purposes beyond ceremonial display, containing thin metal strips that could deflect knife attacks aimed at his head. As the Ides of March approached, Caesar's behavior became increasingly enigmatic. He began giving away personal possessions to friends and subordinates, not as a man preparing for death, but as someone completing a long-planned transformation. The laurel crown he wore during public appearances was itself a message to those few who understood his deeper purposes, a symbol that transcended mere political authority, to represent the marriage of power and wisdom that he believed could save Rome from the fate of previous empires. The distribution of Caesar's personal possessions during his final weeks followed a careful plan designed to ensure that his intellectual legacy would survive his physical death. Important documents were given to trusted associates who would preserve and continue his research. Valuable artifacts were donated to temples and libraries where they would remain accessible to future scholars. Personal items with symbolic significance were distributed to individuals who could decode their hidden messages and continue his work. Caesar's final public appearances were carefully choreographed to convey specific messages to different audiences while appearing to be normal political activities. His speeches contained coded references that members of his intellectual network would recognize and understand. His choice of clothing and accessories sent signals to various political factions about his intentions and expectations. Even his route through the city was designed to visit locations that held symbolic significance for his long-term plans for Rome's development. The laurel crown that became Caesar's signature during his final months was more than a symbol of military victory or political authority. For those who understood Caesar's deeper purposes, it represented the integration of martial prowess, intellectual achievement, and spiritual wisdom that he believed was necessary for effective leadership in a complex civilization. The crown's design incorporated mathematical proportions derived from Egyptian sacred geometry, astronomical symbols representing the cosmos cycles that influence human affairs, and botanical elements representing the natural principles underlying social organization. On the morning of his assassination, Caesar stood once again before his reflection, studying the constellation-shaped birthmark that had marked him since birth. The stars of Cassiopeia seemed different somehow, their pattern suggesting not his approaching death, but a completion of purposes that extended far beyond his individual existence. The secrets he had gathered, the patterns he had identified, the networks he had established, all would survive his physical form and continue working toward the transformation of human civilization he had envisioned. Caesar's final morning ritual represented a culmination of the intellectual and spiritual journey that had driven his entire adult life. The birthmark that resembled Cassiopeia had always reminded him that individual human existence was part of larger cosmic patterns that operated across scales of time and space, far exceeding any single lifetime. His approaching death wasn't a failure of his projects, but their completion. The final step in a transformation process that required his physical sacrifice to achieve its ultimate purposes. The reflection Caesar studied in his mirror that morning showed a man who had successfully integrated multiple aspects of human potential that were usually considered incompatible. He had been simultaneously a warrior and a scholar, a politician and a philosopher, a pragmatist and a visionary. His ability to function effectively in all these roles hadn't resulted from natural talent alone, but from systematic development of capabilities that most people never realized they possessed. Caesar's greatest achievement wasn't conquering Gaul or reforming Roman institutions, but demonstrating the possibility of human evolution beyond conventional limitations. The secrets Caesar carried with him to his death weren't just intellectual curiosities, but practical blueprints for civilizational development that could guide human society through transition periods that had destroyed previous cultures. His understanding of historical cycles, psychological patterns, mathematical principles governing social organization, and spiritual dimensions of political leadership represented knowledge that could prevent the collapse that seemed to be Rome's inevitable fate. The knife wounds that would soon pierce his flesh were, in Caesar's final calculation, not an ending but a beginning. The man who had spent his entire adult life studying the rise and fall of empires had discovered something that filled him with both terror and hope. The possibility that individual mortality might be the price for achieving a form of historical immortality that could reshape the very foundations of human society. Caesar's acceptance of his coming assassination represented his recognition that certain types of social transformation require sacrifice that transcends rational self-interest. His death would serve multiple purposes, eliminating the personal tensions that had made his reforms politically impossible, creating a martyrdom that would inspire future generations, providing Octavian with the emotional and political capital necessary to complete the imperial transformation. and demonstrating that individual leaders could consciously serve evolutionary purposes that extended far beyond their personal survival. In his final moments, as 23 wounds brought his extraordinary life to its close, Gaius Julius Caesar carried with him secrets that would die with his body, but continue living in the institutions, ideas, and hidden networks he had created. The conqueror of Gaul, the lover of Cleopatra, the crossing of the Rubicon. These were merely the visible manifestations of a mind that had spent decades attempting to decode the fundamental algorithms of power, civilization, and human nature itself. The real Caesar, the one history would never fully understand, was not just a man who had accumulated unprecedented power, but a philosopher king who had used that power as a laboratory for exploring the deepest questions about the nature of human society and its possible futures. His death on the Ides of March was not simply the elimination of a dictator, but the silencing of one of history's most profound and dangerous thinkers, a man whose hidden discoveries about the patterns underlying human civilization would continue influencing events long after the last conspirator's dagger had found its mark. Even as his blood pooled on the marble steps of Pompey's theater, Caesar's consciousness remained focused not on personal pain or regret, but on the mathematical certainty that his assassination would trigger the exact sequence of events necessary to transform Rome from a republic into an empire capable of surviving the challenges that had destroyed all previous civilizations. His final breath carried with it the satisfaction of a man who had successfully sacrificed his individual existence for purposes that transcended any single human lifetime. The senators who celebrated Caesar's death that March afternoon had no understanding of what they had truly accomplished. They believed they had saved the Roman Republic from tyranny. But in reality, they had eliminated the one man who might have guided Rome's transformation through peaceful evolution rather than the bloody civil wars that would now seem inevitable. Caesar's assassination wasn't the restoration of traditional Roman government, but the beginning of an imperial system that would dominate the Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. In the hours following Caesar's death, as news of the assassination spread through Rome's streets and beyond, members of his hidden network began implementing contingency plans that had been prepared years in advance. Documents were retrieved from secret locations and delivered to designated recipients. Coded messages were dispatched to watchers throughout the Mediterranean. Financial resources were transferred to accounts that would support ongoing research projects. The intellectual infrastructure Caesar had built during his lifetime would continue functioning long after his physical death. The mathematical model Caesar and Cleopatra had developed proved remarkably accurate in predicting the sequence of events that followed his assassination. The immediate chaos in Rome, the formation of competing political factions, the eventual emergence of Octavian as a dominant leader, the transformation of republican institutions into imperial structures, all these developments unfolded according to patterns the models had anticipated. Caesar's death had been precisely timed to occur at the optimal moment for triggering these transformative changes. Cleopatra's reaction to news of Caesar's assassination revealed the depth of their intellectual partnership and her understanding of its larger purposes. Rather than responding with simple grief or political panic, she immediately began implementing plans they had developed together for preserving and continuing their research. The resources of the Ptolemaic kingdom were mobilized to support scholarship and preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost during the coming period of Roman political upheaval. The mathematical principles and historical models Caesar and Cleopatra had developed were secretly preserved in the Library of Alexandria, where they would influence scholarly research for centuries. Their insights about cyclical patterns in civilizational development would be rediscovered by Islamic scholars during the medieval period and eventually contribute to Renaissance thinking about politics and history. The intellectual legacy of their partnership would survive long after both the Roman and Ptolemaic kingdoms had passed into memory. Octavian's response to his adoptive father's assassination demonstrated how thoroughly Caesar had prepared him to continue their shared intellectual mission. Rather than seeking immediate revenge against conspirators, Octavian focused on consolidating political support and implementing the institutional reforms Caesar had designed. His transformation from a teenager with limited political experience into Augustus, the first Roman emperor, reflected not just personal ambition, but careful execution of plans Caesar had developed for Rome's evolutionary transition. The education Caesar had provided Octavian proved invaluable during the complex political maneuvering that followed the assassination. Octavian's ability to outmaneuver experienced politicians like Mark Antony and Cicero reflected his mastery of psychological analysis techniques Caesar had taught him. His success in building popular support demonstrated his understanding of the mass psychology principles Caesar had developed through decades of military and political experience. Most importantly, his vision of imperial government reflected the constitutional theories Caesar had shared during their private conversations. The network of watchers Caesar had established throughout the Mediterranean provided Octavian with intelligence and analysis that proved crucial during the civil wars that followed Caesar's death. Information about troop movements, political developments, and economic conditions flowed to Octavian from sources his opponents never suspected. This intelligence network, combined the analytical methods Caesar taught him, gave Octavian decisive advantages in both military and political conflicts. The transformation of Octavian into Augustus represented the successful implementation of Caesar's vision for evolutionary rather than revolutionary change in Roman government. The imperial system Augustus established preserved the forms of republican institutions while fundamentally altering their function, exactly as Caesar had planned. This approach avoided the complete collapse and rebuilding that had characterized previous transitions between governmental systems, while ensuring that Rome could adapt to the challenges of governing a Mediterranean-wide empire. Mark Antony's alliance with Cleopatra and their eventual defeat by Octavian followed patterns Caesar's models had predicted with disturbing accuracy. And the psychological profile, which Caesar compiled during years of close association, indicated that he would be unable to resist the combination of political opportunity and personal attraction that Cleopatra represented. Their partnership, while romantically compelling, lacked the intellectual foundation that had made Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra so productive, making their defeat by the more systematically prepared Octavian virtually inevitable. The final destruction of the Ptolemaic kingdom and Cleopatra's suicide marked the end of one phase of Caesar's intellectual legacy, but not its termination. Before her death, Cleopatra ensured that the mathematical and historical research she had conducted with Caesar was preserved in forms that would survive the coming Roman domination of Egypt. Scholars loyal to her cause secreted copies of their work in locations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, where they would be rediscovered by later generations of researchers. The establishment of the Roman Empire under Augustus represented the successful implementation of Caesar's vision for preventing the cyclical collapse that had destroyed previous civilizations. The imperial system combined Roman administrative efficiency with Greek intellectual sophistication and Egyptian mathematical precision, creating a governmental structure capable of managing unprecedented geographical and cultural diversity. The empire's longevity, surviving for more than 5 centuries in the West and more than 15 centuries in the East, demonstrated the validity of Caesar's insights about sustainable political organization. The hidden aspects of Caesar's legacy continued influencing Roman development long after the obvious elements of his political and military achievements had been absorbed into imperial tradition. The intelligence networks he had established evolved into sophisticated spy systems that helped Roman emperors maintain control over vast territories. The psychological analysis techniques he had developed became standard elements of Roman diplomatic and military training. The mathematical models he had created for understanding social cycles influenced imperial policy making for generations. The watchers Caesar had recruited throughout the Mediterranean world continued their research and correspondence long after his death, gradually evolving into an informal intellectual community that transcended political boundaries. Their insights about historical patterns, social psychology, and mathematical principles of organization influenced development in various fields that wouldn't be formally recognized as academic disciplines for centuries. The network represented an early attempt at systematic international scholarly cooperation that anticipated later developments in higher education and scientific research. The preservation of Caesar's intellectual legacy required constant adaptation to changing political circumstances. As the Roman Empire evolved and eventually declined, members of the Watcher Network found new ways to continue their research and preserve their accumulated knowledge. Some became advisors to Germanic kings during the barbarian migrations. Others joined Christian monasteries where they could continue scholarly work under religious protection. A few migrated to the Islamic world where their insights contributed to the flowering of medieval Arabic scholarship. The eventual rediscovery of Caesar's hidden intellectual legacy during the Renaissance provided crucial inspiration for the development of modern political science, psychology, and historical analysis. Scholars who gained access to preserved documents from the Watching Network found sophisticated discussions of topics that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. These rediscovered insights influenced thinkers like Machiavelli, who incorporated Caesar's psychological analysis techniques into his political writings, and later contributed to the development of empirical approaches to studying human behavior and social organization. The story of Julius Caesar, stripped of romantic mythology and political propaganda, reveals a figure far more complex and influential than the conventional historical narrative suggests. His assassination on the Ides of March wasn't simply the elimination of an ambitious politician, but the culmination of an extraordinary intellectual adventure that had explored the deepest questions about human civilization and its potential for conscious evolution. The secrets he carried to his grave represented knowledge that could have reshaped human understanding of politics, psychology, and social organization centuries before these insights were formally rediscovered through conventional academic research. Caesar's true legacy wasn't expansion of Roman territory or the establishment of imperial government, but the demonstration that individual human beings could transcend conventional limitations through systematic study and disciplined application of accumulated knowledge. His life represented a unique experiment in human potential that combined military prowess, political skill, intellectual sophistication, and spiritual insight in ways that hadn't been achieved before and would rarely be equaled afterward. The man who died on the steps of Pompey's theater had lived as both a practical politician and a visionary philosopher, successfully bridging the gap between immediate political necessity and long-term civilizational development. The mathematical precision with which Caesar had orchestrated his own assassination reflected his understanding that individual sacrifice might sometimes be necessary to achieve purposes that transcended personal survival. His death wasn't a failure of his intellectual projects, but their completion, the final demonstration that human consciousness could evolve beyond the limitations of biological self-interest to serve objectives that operated across multiple generations and cultural boundaries. In accepting his assassination as necessary for Rome's transformation, Caesar had achieved a form of immortality that no military conquest or political achievement could have provided. The blood that pooled around Caesar's body on the Ides of March carried with it the genetic heritage of one of history's most remarkable minds. But the ideas that had driven his extraordinary life would prove far more durable than any biological legacy. His insights about human psychology, social organization, historical patterns, and political transformation would continue influencing human development long after the Roman Empire itself had passed into memory. The real Caesar, the philosopher king who had used political power as a tool for exploring the fundamental questions about human civilization, would achieve a form of intellectual immortality that exceeded anything he could have accomplished through conventional political or military success. As the sun set over Rome on that fateful March day, casting long shadows across the blood-stained marble where Caesar's body lay, the transformation he had orchestrated was already beginning. The networks he had established, the individuals he had trained, the ideas he had developed, and the institutional changes he had initiated would continue operating according to principles he had discovered through decades of systematic study and experimentation. The death of Gaius Julius Caesar marked not the end of his influence, but the beginning of his most profound phase, the period when his vision for human civilizational evolution would be tested against the harsh realities of historical change and either prove its validity through successful implementation or join the countless other utopian dreams that had failed to transform human society. The ultimate measure of Caesar's achievement wouldn't be found in the monuments erected to honor his memory or the histories written to celebrate his conquests, but in the subtle ways his insights about human nature and social organization continued influencing the development of Western civilization for centuries after his death. The man who had lived simultaneously as a warrior, politician, scholar, and visionary had demonstrated that human consciousness could transcend conventional boundaries that limited most individual lives and achieve a form of historical significance that operated across multiple scales of time and cultural development. In the end, Julius sees his greatest secret wasn't any single discovery about politics, psychology, or historical patterns, but his demonstration that individual human beings possess far greater potential than most people ever realized. His life represented a unique experiment in human development that combined rigorous intellectual discipline with practical political experience. Systematic study of human behavior with intuitive understanding of social dynamics, mathematical analysis of historical patterns with visionary imagination about future possibilities. The legacy of this extraordinary experiment would continue influencing human civilization long after the specific details of his political and military achievements had been forgotten, inspiring future generations to explore the boundaries of human potential and work toward the conscious evolution of human society.